Hello. It's another month of moon work for our red tent, and this month I am excited to be covering the nodes. And what's so interesting to me, because the nodes are a little bit more of a concept that's a bit harder to grasp, and yet you guys have been really bringing up the nodes and asking questions about it. So I was really excited that this would be the month that we would delve into that. And my reason for doing nodes this month is that we're in Cancer season, and this will be the Cancer new moon. And Cancer is the sign that is ruled by the moon. So it's the moon's home sign. And the nodes are lunar nodes, and they literally connect to the process of the moon. And basically, instead of them being planets, they're called points. So you will often hear in astrology, astrologers saying, if you have any planets or points near whatever it is. And in this case, we're talking about points. So points are sensitive places on a chart. So when we look at your own nodal axis on your chart, which obviously we're going to dive into, then those are going to always be sensitive points on your chart for all the reasons we're going to discuss today. But where the nodes are now are sensitive points in the sky now. And that also plays into your transits and what's happening in your space now. So it's not just your personal nodal axis, but the collective, the current nodal axis that is in the sky. So basically, the nodes are the points at which eclipses are currently happening in. And eclipses go in 19-year cycles. So let's just say right now we have the North Node in Taurus. It's about to actually step into Aries. So it will be another 19 years before the North Node is in Taurus again. But the nodal axis turns into another sign and then is there for 19 months. So 19 months in a sign, 19 years for the whole entire, and this is give or take, for the whole entire process. So when you were 19, you would have had your first nodal return. But when you were 8, you would have had a nodal opposition, which would have meant that the North Node was where your South Node was at birth and vice versa. And this is also a very pertinent space to look. So North and South Node are always exactly opposite each other. It's kind of impossible for them not to be. And it, as I say, it is where these nodes are situated that is in terms of how the, without getting too technical, it's how the eclipses will form, because either it's sun, moon, earth, or sun, earth, moon in exact alignment. That's when we have an eclipse. So those are the points at which the eclipses, the nodes are. And the nodes actually move backwards. So if we were looking at the nodes in an astrology chart, they would be moving clockwise, because the planets in astrology move anti-clockwise. And I think this did come up as a little bit of a confusion, because when we're looking at the outer rim of our astrology wheel, it is moving, like for your rising sign, it'll move 1 degree in, probably you're seeing this as anti-clockwise as I'm doing it, but this is my clockwise, 1 degree in a clockwise movement per 4 minutes. That's how quickly the rising sign changes. But the planets themselves are actually moving anti-clockwise. However, the nodes move backwards, so they move clockwise. So that's not really that important for you to really understand how and why that works, excepting that if you're watching the current nodes move, you'll think, how did we go from Taurus back into Aries? That's how, because the nodes move backwards. So we've been in an almost completed 19-month cycle of Taurus Scorpio, because those two are opposite each other, Taurus Scorpio nodes, and it's about to shift into Aries Libra. Okay. So when we start to look at where those nodes are in your, first of all, where that current stuff transit is happening in your chart, it's going to give you an understanding of wherever the eclipses are happening in your life is where the big changes are happening. But if we take it to the birth chart, then obviously it's much more personalized. That's where your work is happening. So in Vedic astrology, of which I know very little, but the mythology behind the nodes is kind of cool. It's the head and the tail of the dragon. Rahu, the head of the dragon, and Ketu, the tail of the dragon. And it's almost like, in some ways, you could look at it as the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail, but they don't quite catch each other. So it's like one is the head, the north node, the way I'm going, and I can see. And one is the tail, the place I'm coming from. But the head is always eating and the tail is always, well, you can guess what the tail is doing. So there is this disembodiment, this sort of separation of operational systems that they have, but they are part of the same axis. So it becomes quite a pertinent Dharma karma conversation. And one of the ways that I really, really loved, I wish I could remember the astrologer that described it this way and actually give them credit for it, but I can't remember who it was. I listened to a lot of lectures on astrology. But this was one of my favorite ways of describing it, because you will have a lot of astrologers that say the south node of our karma is where we're coming from and what we're leaving behind, the tail of the dragon. And the north node of Dharma is what we're moving towards, the head of the dragon. But I much prefer the other sort of way of looking at it, where you don't leave something behind. It's not like you've got to shed that and gain that. You're always kind of going between the two. And so this was the description that really, really worked for me. The south node is what we came into this lifetime with, and it's information and knowledge and understanding that we've gleaned over lifetimes. So we worked for that. So why would we want to drop all those skills? But we came in with that, and we have cultivated that garden. The north node is like a jungle, and we would like to learn more about the jungle, learn how to cultivate that jungle. So that's the north node, and that's why we have to go and put in the work in the jungle in this lifetime, because we've already cultivated the garden of the south node. And that gave me a really good visual of how to understand it for myself. This is another reason I love to get a lot of different takes on things, because something will really land with you and other things won't. And it's the exact same thing. It's just said in a different way. This is back to me being a Gemini, where I get all those different little bits and then I go, ha, now I get it. Or that one really resonated. And that one, I didn't actually understand that until I heard this, and now that makes sense. So the nodes, as I say, they are a little bit more abstract and a little bit more challenging to understand. Also, like when we're working with planets, like we've looked at Venus, let's use her. She's very present at the moment, about to go on her retrograde process. So let's say we're working with Venus. Venus has a very specific kind of weight to her. So she has very specific, this is what you are going to look at with me. And there's a, she's material, you know, she is something that, well, theoretically we could touch, we could feel, we can certainly see. The nodes are not that. So even in that kind of way, they're a little bit more abstract and a little bit more challenging for us to understand what that means. And that's also why it's kind of got this past life kind of feel to it. So I can't always remember what I learned in previous lives. I don't remember consciously those lives. For the most part, we don't. But things kind of get remembered as we journey through life, as we are triggered in certain situations. And for me, it's been very powerful, and we will use my chart as an example shortly, but for me, it's been very powerful to kind of dive in and understand what, when I understand my south node, it made a lot of sense to me as to who I am and why I do the work I do. When I understand my north node, I understand, oh, but I can't actually just do the work I want to do unless north node, unless this lifetime is very much working on the north node process. And the houses in which your north and south node land is also very, very important for your interpretation, just as the houses of the transiting nodes, it's very, very important. If you're having transiting eclipse cycles on your angles, and you'll remember your angles are your four main houses. So if it's in your first house, your fourth house, your seventh house, or your 10th house, the four primary sort of directions, then those are going to be eclipse seasons. And I can attest to that because I've literally been having that. I've been having it in terms of my my fourth house and my 10th house. And that has been very much like I've been literally changing homes and really redefining my reputation, my career, the way I'm seen in the world. And the way I can come out in the world through this process. And if you think about it, as we're coming to the end of the last 18-month eclipse cycle, my whole process of getting out of my marriage to now has literally been within that eclipse cycle. So you can see that was a much bigger eclipse cycle for me personally than one that wasn't in the angular houses. And that's why it's really important to take particularly that into account. But even if it's not angular houses, you might have a lot of planets in cadent houses, and that's where the eclipses are falling, and therefore it's going to be intense for you. So it does help you to understand, where am I working and what am I working with? And then, as with everything in astrology, it's about pattern and it's about cycles. So if we then come back and go, okay, well, what happened the last time that the eclipses were in Scorpio and Taurus? And you might say that the Taurus has been the North Node this time, but what happened when Taurus was the South Node 8 years ago? And what happened when Taurus was the North Node? You know, for those of us who've lived in this group, we've all had a nodal return, but some of us too. But yes, you know, you see where I'm going with this. When we look back, we will see where the similarities lie. Of course, it will be different because this is a Dharma karma process. And as we develop mastery in our lives, which is literally by living them and having more experiences, a 5-year-old is not going to have the wherewithal to converse in the same way as a 19-year-old is, as a 36-year-old, as a 60-year-old, because of that life experience, because of that mastery of the journey. So I hope that's kind of given you a good indication of how we kind of understand the nodes as these sensitive spaces, remembering that eclipses are like lunations, a full and new moon on sort of steroids, like they're that much bigger, and their impact is longer. So they're almost like 6-month impact of a full moon, for example, if it's a solar eclipse. And that's also a full moon, a full moon is a lunar eclipse, and a new moon is a solar eclipse. That's how we would call them. And for me, this is easy to remember, just because if it's a full moon, the moon is like the spotlight, so it's a lunar eclipse. And eclipses are not always total. Sometimes they are not even visible at all wherever you are in the world. That doesn't mean that they're not impactful. They're always impactful. However, a total lunar eclipse will be more impactful than a partial lunar eclipse. And also, if you are in the area in the world, and there is a little thing you can look at to see if, you know, if your part of the world is going to be covered by the total lunar eclipse. For example, there was a big lunar eclipse, I think it was 2018, and it was called the Great American Eclipse, because it was total across a huge portion of America. And then huge things happen. I mean, it's still something astrologers discuss, because that was such a big changing space for particularly that band of America that was literally seeing this total lunar eclipse. Whereas in South Africa, for example, though that was a total lunar eclipse, it wasn't viewed as one here, and it was less impactful here. Impactful always, but less impactful. And as I say, with the Great American Eclipse, that would be very much focused on, well, not just the individual American living in that space, yes, for the individual American living in that space, but also for the collective, the land, the space that they lived on. And so they were collectively having some kind of a intense breakdown to break through, or up leveling of energy. So it's something that is, I mean, there are so many books written on the nodes, and I think there are so many astrologers who have great respect and hold great weight with the nodes and understanding the nodes. And myself, I totally agree with that. I have found them to be kind of, I want to say, a subtle, but actually not so subtle. So it's easy for us to focus on where the planets are in our chart, again, because they're obvious. But more and more, as I work in astrology and as I do many more readings with other people, I see the importance of understanding this dance between the nodes, your back and forth with your South and North node. And definitely for years now, I've been working with the transiting eclipses, and I have found them to be really, really amazing to work with. And as I say, recognizing just personally the difference of having an eclipse season in angular houses has been crazy. So it will be different for each of us depending on what other planets and all the, the whole point of astrology and us doing it this way is that it is super complex and overwhelming at the best of times. But if we find our way to kind of condense it into these little parts, just take a little bit of time to let this land and then start to weave in the other bits. I say it every time, but I'm going to keep saying it because that's the point of how we're trying to learn and integrate and embody something. And it's easier to embody a planet because a planet is an astral body than it is to embody a concept of a sensitive point in the sky. But as I say, what's so exciting for me is, well, first of all, I'm so impressed with how everybody has been getting it so beautifully. And second of all, it's like you have actually already been pulling this in, not with me saying so, just naturally pulling it in. Quite a few of you have brought those questions into the Zooms. So I really feel positive about you enjoying this particular class. So the next video, we're going to just look at my chart again. I know it best, and I think that worked well last month. Feel free to drop in and give me comments if you want to do it differently. But we're going to look at my chart, and I'm going to explain to you how to find everything in your chart and what the sort of work side of things is for this particular homework session. It's a little different because the nodes are a little different.